To unpack this seismic shift in American law and power, we're joined by two guests who bring the critical insights from New York. The Pulitzer Prize-winning professor at Rochester Institute of Technology, Dr. David K. Johnston, and from Washington, D.C., the national security analyst and geopolitical strategist, Mr. John Rosamando. Gentlemen, welcome to Think Tank. Together we'll explore how this decision reshapes the separation of powers, the risks of executive overreach, and what it means for American democracy. Dr. Johnston, let's start with you. How significant is the Supreme Court's decision to limit nationwide injunctions in terms of presidential power?
Well, thank you for having me on. And just to be clear, no doctor, just Mr. or Professor.
Sure.
This is a very serious problem, but it's not quite as black and white as you presented it. State governments may still seek nationwide injunctions. Class action suits can be used to obtain nationwide injunctions. And in fact, the litigants in the case before the Supreme Court within hours filed a new class action case, which would allow a single judge to make such a nationwide injunction. But nonetheless, this is very serious. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, basically said, we're just a couple of Supreme Court decisions away from no longer being a democracy. And it's been my position since February 26th, when Donald announced, and Donald, whom I've known and covered for 37 years, he who saves his nation violates a law, that Donald, in fact, has declared himself now to be our dictator, and he is simply consolidating power. He's not consolidated all of it, but as I've warned since at least 2011, Donald doesn't know what's in the Constitution, doesn't understand that the president merely executes the laws passed by Congress and follows its directions, plus is commander-in-chief of the military, and believes that he is all-powerful. In fact, he said in his first term, I have an Article 2, that's the executive section of our Constitution, I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. It says nothing of the kind.
Mr. Rosamando, do you see this ruling as necessary correction, or does it risk undermining the judicial oversight of the executive branch?
Well, let's put it this way. That's what you have the Supreme Court to do, to be the co-equal check on the presidency, not a trial court that has a very specific area of jurisdiction. So, these rulings should work to make their way through the courts up to the Supreme Court, and let the Supreme Court decide whether certain actions taken by the president are constitutional or unconstitutional. I think that the president has very broad powers when it comes to running the country. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, for example, suspended habeas corpus in the Civil War. Other presidents, Nixon tried to impound funds, which is probably going to be an issue for President, Trump on certain things. But that's what the Supreme Court decides, not for the trial court to be able to exceed its jurisdiction.
Professor Johnston, do you think that this would embolden Trump or any future president to actually test the constitutional limits more aggressively, even if they're unaware of the actual authority or powers they possess?
Oh, it's exactly what Donald has been doing all the way along, just as he did in his life as a con artist and a career serial criminal for 40 years. He's very much testing where there are weak spots, where he can expand his authority. By the way, the president has no power to suspend habeas corpus. Congress had to step in when Lincoln declared the suspension of habeas corpus, which is, anyone who's read the Constitution knows, a power held solely by Congress, just as the power to declare war is held solely by Congress. The executive's duty is only to carry out the instructions of Congress. Yes, absolutely, you're going to see more testing of this. You're going to see more assertions that the presidential power is broad when it's not. And we're particularly going to see challenges, as your other guest mentioned, about Trump not spending money authorized by Congress. We went through that Nixon presidency, and the Supreme Court was quite clear. The president must faithfully execute, not make his own decisions. So if money is appropriated for a purpose, the president must spend that money. He can go back to Congress and ask them to change their directive, but he has no power to overturn congressional directives like spending matters.
Mr. Samando, do you believe now that the Supreme Court's decision would only benefit Trump, or does it set a precedent for all future presidents?
Well, of course, it's not just Donald Trump, it's for all presidents. And it also sets a reminder of the jurisdiction of trial courts. That's been the Trump administration's argument in all these cases, is that one district judge ought not to have authority over the entire country. The only court that was established by the Constitution was the Supreme Court. And and it's up to Congress to dictate this breadth of the trial court's jurisdiction. But when you have a small court in Washington D.C. Dictating for the entire country, it doesn't have that authority. It only has authority over those litigants in its jurisdiction. Then it has to make its way through the appeals up to the Supreme Court, and it's up to the Supreme Court to decide these matters.
Well, Professor Johnston, so what role does Congress play now, or how did it change now that the judiciary's power to check the executive is diminished?
Well, and constrained, but still we can have individual district court trial judges imposing nationwide bans provided they meet the new standards the Supreme Court has set. Well, Congress has not been acting as it's right to do, and the Constitution provides for it to do. I mean, if Congress, for example, wants to end all humanitarian aid, which stopped on June 30th, then Congress should pass a law doing exactly that. Trump has no authority to shut down that aid and to not turn over food and medicine to people for whom it was designated. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has always been behind the curve of history. And the Supreme Court in these cases is when a resolution is likely to be favorable to Donald Trump, they seem to be able to act with lightning speed. When it's not, they delay to his benefit. And there's a real fundamental problem here because several members of the current court are what are called originalists or textualists. And I've been a professor of law now for 15, 16 years, where we discuss this in my classes. And the plain meaning, for example, of the 14th Amendment, that all persons born in the United States, citizens thereof, Trump is just trying to undo. By the way, if he were to undo it, I think it would challenge his own citizenship. It would certainly challenge the citizenship of his current wife and his youngest son. But of course, rules are for other people, not for Donald.
Mr. Osormando, so are there any alternative legal tools left for those who want to challenge executive orders, or has the court effectively shut that down?
Well, we have a process. If the trial court rules against the administration takes it to the appeals court. Then the appeals court makes its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides what happens with the constitutionality of the presidential executive order, because the president is the co-equal of the Supreme Court and co-equal of the Congress, and vice versa in our system. The thing that the Trump administration has justified is rejection of birthright citizenship is based on the debates in the 14th Amendment that didn't say that people who were not American citizens automatically became have their children become citizens, which is something that a lot of Republicans have been wanting to deal with for some time.
Mm-hmm. Professor Johnston, critics warn of a return to the imperial presidency. Now, what historical parallels do you see, and how real is this risk today?
Oh, this is an enormous risk. I mean, even Justice Sotomayor is now acknowledging that America as a democracy may not continue under Trump. And way back in 2011, and perhaps before then, but that's the oldest I can find where I made a record of it, I warned that if Donald Trump ever got to the White House, he would never leave peacefully. It turned out to be true, as we saw in January of 2021. And Trump recently said that he had made one mistake in his life. It was leaving the White House in 2021. Donald always seen himself as special, as being beyond any kind of control. It was true in his business career when I spent hundreds of hours with him in interviews and conversations, and it continues in the White House. And in fact, Donald said to a magazine the other day, The Atlantic, I run the country and the whole world, something I had also said was in his mind 14 years earlier. And Donald and his supporters had said ridiculous, and finally he came out and said it. So we need to be very concerned in the United States that one branch, the branch that is supposed to carry out the directives of Congress and lead the military, is expanding its power in ways that are absolutely inimical to the liberties of the people. And we also need to pay attention to how the Republican Party has abandoned all sorts of principles about individual liberty, reducing the intrusions of the federal government under Donald Trump. They have abandoned those as principles, and they have embraced the idea that whatever Donald wants, he should get.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Rosamando, do you agree with the argument that the ruling restores the constitutional balance intended by the founders?
Well, I believe that it does. I also think it's kind of absurd and silly to say that Trump is upending democracy. The plurality that elected President Trump wanted these policies, particularly as it has to do with the invasion of close to 20 million criminal aliens into the United States in the past 4 years. So I think that President Trump's actions are the embodiment of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Professor Johnston, you brought up the issues of citizenship, birthright, citizenship, and the immigration policy. How do you think this decision affects the ongoing legal battles?
Well, at the end of the day, I expect the U.S. Supreme Court will uphold the 14th Amendment and uphold the principle of stare decisis. That is, this is a settled matter in the law. If it decides otherwise, then the proper action for the U.S. government would be to deport the First Lady of the United States, who entered the country on a visa that did not permit her to work, and yet we have her records showing she was doing paid work. That would, under the Trump administration's positions, mean she should be stripped of her citizenship and thrown out of the country. Not that that would ever happen. The reality is there are about 11 or 12, not 20 million people who are in this country without full permission. Many of them that Trump is deporting actually have permission. They have pending cases before the courts. There have been some green card holders. And indeed, the Trump administration has removed from the country as if they were aliens, U.S. citizens. And Trump has now spoken several times about his desire to strip American citizens of their citizenship if he doesn't like them and throw them out of the country. I don't know what could be more dictatorial than that claim. All of this is a serious threat to the liberties enabled by our Constitution. The reason the United States has been so successful is the principle of liberty, of freedom, and at the same time, the protection of the rights of everyone under due process of law. Now, for sure, our history is very imperfect on that issue. But at this stage of society, 250 years almost after the Declaration of Independence, we should be moving to a more perfect union, not toward a dictatorship where a man can say, I don't like you. I don't like the things you've done. We're going to strip you of your citizenship and throw you out of the country, especially since he would never apply those standards to his spouse, to his father, his grandfather, or his mother.
Mr. Rossomando, so what safeguards remain, or what's left to prevent the executive overreach under this new legal framework?
Well, I mean, there's still plenty of opportunities. We can go through the Supreme Court. And that's, if you have a national matter, I mean, the states can still bring matters to the Supreme Court. You can ask for, an emergency stay. The most powerful, people in our country are the state's attorneys general. So they still have a lot of say on these matters. But I think that, when it comes to, concerns about, president, if you have people who lied in their citizenship application, that's a felony. That's something that can disqualify you. Were you part of, a criminal enterprise and lied about that? Were you part of, say, a radical extremist party and then lied about that? Those are things that the law says can disqualify people from retaining their citizenship, not Donald Trump's win.
Professor Johnson, in the past, federal courts were key in stopping controversial executive orders. What tools remain now, and will they be able to do it effectively and quickly if the need may rise?
Well, as your other guest points out, the courts still have the authority to address executive orders, especially if it's a case brought by a state government or as a class action, although the Supreme Court is incredibly hostile to class action litigation. One of the key problems here is the time it takes for these matters. If we're going to run the country by executive order, something, by the way, that Republicans traditionally yelled and screamed about and said this was an inappropriate way to do things by and large, then we need to have a system to fast track these cases and prevent the slow walking of them, as we've seen happen with a number of matters involving Donald Trump. And I absolutely agree that if you lied on your citizenship application or violated the law, you should be subject to deportation. And by that standard, Melania Trump should be arrested immediately and removed from the country because she worked without permission when she was an alien in this country. And as I said, you're not going to see that happen because rules Donald wants are not for him, they're for other people, especially those he doesn't like.
Mr. Rossomando, one final question. What message does this Supreme Court's decision send to the world about American democracy and the understanding of democracy and the rule of law?
About democracy is this overblown bloviation by Democrats because they lost the last election. I mean, the people who voted for Donald voted for these deportations. They voted for an end to open borders. They voted for an end to a lot of what they believe were an abuse of constitutional authority. But I think that you definitely need to have review whoever the president is now, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's some other person in the future. But I think that our democracy is very healthy and alive and well. And for Democrats who lost the last election to moan about this is just silly.
Professor David K. Johnston and Mr. John Rossomando, thank you both for being part of our think tank.